All right, Genesis 41, let's call this one Forgotten Part 2. Why? Because it actually is a continuation of chapter 40 where we saw Joseph forgotten by the cupbearer for whom he interpreted a dream that actually gave him good news that in 3 days he would be restored to the service of Pharaoh. In exchange for that good news, he was supposed to remember Joseph before Pharaoh and hopefully help get him out of his unjust incarceration. But the cupbearer forgets and only remembers after what we see following in chapter 41, beginning in verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and it is going to go on from there to describe a dream that he doesn't understand and that his wise guys or wise men can't interpret. And so that is going to prompt the cupbearer to remember, oh, wait, there was the young Hebrew guy who interpreted my dream. He did it accurately, and maybe if we call him, boom, that's going to open the prison doors for Joseph. He's going to seize the opportunity. He's going to interpret Pharaoh's dream. He's going to tell him, look, you're dreaming an ominous time period on the horizon for Egypt. What's going to happen is you're going to have 7 great years, but don't get too happy because they're going to be followed by 7 years of famine. It would be wise to use those 7 prosperous years to prepare for the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh is going to appreciate the warning, and not only is he going to appreciate it, he is going to ask Joseph to lead them through that 7 years of plenty to prepare for the 7 years of famine. And that is going to open the door not only for Joseph to rise in Egypt, it is going to open the door for him to forget his own suffering, and thus forgotten part 2. Because the man who was once forgotten just a chapter before is going to be privileged enough to forget the depth of misery that he had during his difficult years. As we pick up in verse 50 of chapter 41, we're going to see how deeply it impacts him, so deeply that it's going to affect the way that he names his kids. Verse 50, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship in all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Understand how his affliction and his years of being forgotten carved a deep enough groove in this man's soul that it impacted the way that he named his kids. And does that suggest that he is laying his emotional baggage on his kids' shoulders? Maybe. But maybe what it's also doing is helping him to instill in his later generation how they got there. And so as they appreciate the prosperity of Egypt, it's important for them to understand the backstory of how difficult a road it was to getting to that prosperity. We can often appreciate when we see kids who are born into money, appreciating how hard work and sacrifice goes into their privilege and their prosperity. Even more so if they are conditioned and trained to work hard so that they can produce something that provides not just a blessing for them and their own families, but for many others, because that is once again, the lesson that we're seeing in the lives of the spiritual descendants of Abraham, people who are providing blessings far beyond their own circle. And so that is in many ways what it seems like Joseph is doing in naming his 2 sons. He is helping them to remember how they got there, and more importantly, going forward, who they are the spiritual descendants of, people who think bigger than just their narrow circle. And so ultimately, when we are looking at the end of this story, when Joseph is forgetting his hardship, he is not forgetting to show gratitude to God. And gratitude can come in many forms. It can come in an audible thank you. It can come in trying to pay a blessing forward, understanding that if you've gotten a blessing from somebody who's well off, it's not always the most efficient to try to pay them back. Why? They got everything they need already. You always want to respect them, but sometimes it can help just as much. And sometimes they will ask you directly to pay that forward to somebody else who is in need like you. But understand this, sometimes gratitude comes in the form of showing appreciation for opportunities that God gives you. And in interpreting the dream for Pharaoh, he's saying, look, don't look at these 7 years of plenty lightly. It's going to be reminiscent of what Jesus is going to do after he feeds one of these large crowds in one of his miracles, when he says, do not neglect those pieces that are left over from the feeding of this large crowd. Gather them up and appreciate the blessing that God has given you. And so in times like this, when we can appreciate how much it might have meant to save during the good times, even if you didn't save like you wanted to during the good years, appreciate what God has given you now as we get through this next challenge.